Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real shame that we're not in Lyme Regis in person, but this is, I guess, the next best thing. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today about what can ammonites teach us about life in ancient oceans. These are my favorite group of fossils, a very well-known group of fossils, and hopefully I'll be able to teach you some things that you perhaps didn't know about them in the next sort of half an hour or so. So if we were at the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival, normally, I guess you would be listening to my talk, but you would probably also go out onto the beach and look for fossils. And probably the fossils that you would find most commonly on the beach at Lyme Regis are ammonites. So this is one of my favorite places to go when I'm in Lyme Regis. It's just on Monmouth Beach to the west of the town. And here you find this amazing exposed layer of rock, which is full of thousands and thousands of ammonite fossils. And all the way along the beach at Lyme and right the way along the Jurassic coast of England, you can find ammonite fossils. Some of them are very big, some of them are very small, so there's a 50p piece for scale. Some of them are sort of just the impressions of the inside of the shell. Sometimes you find the shells themselves, and sometimes you find the impressions of the outside of the shells. And you don't need to be a paleontologist or an expert in fossils to know that what you're looking at here are the remains of an animal, a creature that was alive millions of years ago that has been fossilized. And the fact that we're finding so many of them in the rocks here shows that they were very, very common animals. And there must have been thousands of them swimming around in the oceans, which are now represented by these sedimentary rocks. And in fact, that's why ammonites are so well known. Most people know what an ammonite is, or at least that it's a fossil without knowing anything about it, because they're found all over the world. So this is a map, and each colored dot on the map represents a place, a site around the world of different age, different geological age, where you can find ammonite fossils. And they're found on every single continent, even down in Antarctica, right the way up to Greenland, close to the North Pole, all the way through Europe, North America, all over the world. They're incredibly common fossils. But what are they? What are these fossils? What were the creatures like that made these fossils? Well, ammonites, or ammonoids, as they're often known by scientists, but everybody refers to them as ammonites, so that's what I'm going to call them in this talk, are molluscs, cephalopod molluscs. So they're related to squid, cuttlefish, octopus, and the nautilus, which is the only cephalopod mollusk around today, which makes an external shell, like the ammonites. All the rest are sort of soft, squidgy creatures with an internal shell. Ammonites are cephalopods. They first appear in the fossil record a long, long time ago in rocks that are dated to about 400 million years ago. So I'm a geologist, so I like to show figures and pictures like this where time is often going from the bottom of the picture up to the top. So today is at the top of this picture, and this is a sort of family tree of cephalopod mollusks. You can see at the top here the cuttlefish, the squid, the octopus, and the nautilus, and going back very, very far back into geological time. And I've just highlighted in red here the ammonoids, the ammonites, and you can see they branch off the family tree of cephalopod mollusks about 400 million years ago. And they were around for a long, long time. They went extinct, they disappeared about 66 million years ago. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we think that is during this talk. So they were around for a really, really long time. And how do we know that they're cephalopods, and what were their shells actually like? Well, here's a picture of an ammonite fossil, and if we're lucky and it's very well preserved and we break this shell open and see its internal structure, we see that it's divided up into several different parts. So you have the aperture, which when the animal was alive is where it was sort of sticking out of the shell. Then you have the body chamber, this big empty space in the shell, which when the animal was alive were where the soft and squishy bits were. And then you have this chambered part of the shell called the phragmocone. And the phragmocone is divided up into these chambers using by the structure called septa. And the septa, where they touch the outside of the shell, they branch into these amazing structures called sutures, which are very, very useful for classifying different ammonite shells. But probably when the animal was alive, they were useful for actually supporting the shell, a little bit like the beams that may be in your house supporting the roof. Now, ammonites grow their shell, as do all cephalopod molluscs, throughout their life. And so they're often these spiral shapes. So if we break the shell down and go back through the spiral shell, right back to the very smallest part, we're actually looking at the shell as it was grown when the animal was very, very young. And that part of the shell is called the ammonitella. It tends to be the very middle, the smallest part of the shell. And then the other structure you can sometimes see preserved in ammonite fossils is this sort of tube that runs through the shell called the siphuncle. It runs through all of those chambers and into the body chamber. And when the animal was alive, this was probably full of blood vessels, which helped the animal to fill or empty those chambers with liquid or gas to help the shell maintain buoyancy in the water. And one of the reasons that we know that ammonites are cephalopods is that, of course, we can compare them to modern cephalopods, and we have a modern cephalopod which does the same thing. It builds this external shell with chambers in it, and that's the nautilus. So there's a modern nautilus shell cut in half just to show you how similar it is to these ancient ammonite fossils. And ammonite shells, as we've already seen just in the pictures from Lyme Regis, come in many different shapes and sizes. Some of them are these nice spirals. Some of them, though, are very kind of bizarre shapes. So here you've got some sort of straight shells. You've got these very, very weird looking, very odd coiled shells. You've got these that look a little bit like snails, still coiled round, but sort of stacked up on top of each other. Some that are still sort of spirals, but the spirals don't touch each other. These weird looking shells are called heteromorph ammonites, and they appear several times during the fossil record of ammonites, but most commonly you just see these nice sort of simple spiral shaped shells. And the ammonite fossil record is so good because they make these shells. These shells are made of carbonate, much like clams and snails and the nautilus today, and they preserve very well in the fossil record. Curiously, of course, we don't have very much evidence for what the soft parts of the animal actually looked like, the animal that lived in the shell. And if any of you were at the Fossil Festival this morning and you saw the talk by my colleague Thomas Clements, he talked a little bit more about how fossils preserve and why not some fossils appear in the fossil record, and why soft tissues of things like ammonites are often not preserved at all. And it's thought that perhaps there was some nasty gas or substance in the soft tissue of ammonites that meant that they just decayed away. They didn't fossilize very well at all. So we only have the shells to go on, but there's an awful lot of information that we can learn about these things just from the shells, just from the fossil record of their shell. And people have been trying to do this for a very, very long time. So all the way back to sort of the first scientists and paleontologists that were sort of digging up fossils and studying them, back to the time that Mary Anning was finding fossils at Lyme Regis. Mary Anning, of course, is most famous for finding these big marine reptile skeletons, but she also found a lot of ammonites and prepared and sold in her fossil shop in Lyme Regis a lot of ammonite fossils. And so this is one of these very early reconstructions, an attempt to reconstruct from fossils what an ancient ecosystem looked like, made by Henry de la Beche, who was a friend of Mary Anning's, and this is based on Mary Anning's findings at Lyme Regis. And there are actually ammonites reconstructed in this painting. And we're still trying to do this today. This is a sort of modern day version of that. It's a painting by an artist called James Mackay, who's talking at the Fossil Festival tomorrow morning. You can listen to his talk and he'll be teaching you how to draw your favorite prehistoric beasts. And this is a painting by James, a modern reconstruction of the same environment, this Jurassic environment based on fossils from Lyme Regis. And here you can see he's put some ammonites into the painting. How do we know that this is what they may have looked like and what they may have been doing? You can see them swimming in the water column there with these ichthyosaurs. But how do we know that just from their shells? Well, one thing we can do is compare them to the only cephalopod alive today with an external shell, and this is the nautilus. And this is a video of some nautilus taken by some colleagues of mine in the deep South Pacific Ocean. You can see 3 nautilus swimming there. two adults and a juvenile. They've been attracted to this baited trap that the scientists have left on the seafloor, and the Nautilus are sort of queuing up, desperately trying to get at that food. And you can see there, they're floating sort of buoyant in the water column, but very close to the seafloor here. You can see the tentacles of the animal sticking out of the front. And you can see the eye as well. So it gives us some idea of what ammonites may actually have looked like, and certainly how they can move. You can see how they're moving around as well. Nautilus moves by jet propulsion and forces water out of this sort of tubular structure at the front, and it swims backwards. It looks kind of clumsy and weird, but it does that very successfully. And as it says here, it's the only surviving cephalopod with an external shell. It lives in this deep water environment in the South Pacific Ocean. So perhaps quite different to some of these ancient ammonites, which are found in rocks all over the world, some of which are not deep water sedimentary rocks. But it gives us some idea to start thinking about what these things look like when they were alive. Now, the first thing we can do with the shells themselves is perhaps we can start to actually use the shells to build models and think about how ammonites might compare to the Nautilus. And again, people have been doing this for a very long time. So this picture on the left-hand side is a drawing from a paper published in 1941 by a guy called Truman, who made these simple models of ammonite shells. And he assumed that the animal filled that body chamber at the start of the shell. And he just calculated, okay, so if the animal is a lump of flesh that fills that body chamber, what are these shells going to be like in terms of their orientation and their buoyancy? He reconstructed the shells in this sort of orientation, so quite similar to the Nautilus in the previous in the video on the previous slide. Now, today we have powerful computers, and we can actually make, using computer software, these really fancy looking three-dimensional models and do it all in a computer. We don't have to do it by hand. We can put those models into sort of experiments on the computer to test how they might be buoyant or not, and how they might interact with the water, and how ammonites might have swam. And models show that most ammonites were, like the Nautilus, neutrally buoyant. They were able to float in the water, and they probably swam backwards like the Nautilus. Now that kind of makes sense for those nice spiral-shaped ones that look like the Nautilus, but what about the weird heteromorph ammonites like this? Well, here are some three-dimensional models by a colleague of mine called David Peterman. And David has tried to use the same methods to reconstruct the buoyancy of these shells and the animals that lived in them and how they would have swum and functioned. Now, people always thought that heteromorph ammonites, what are they doing? How can an animal that's shaped like a paperclip or a weird spiral, how can that swim around like a Nautilus? But actually, David's work suggests that even some of these weird heteromorph shapes have their advantages, that some of them may have actually been sort of stabilizing elements. So if, for example, you're just floating in the water and you get knocked by something, maybe an ichthyosaur comes by and tries to take a bite out of you, and your shell starts moving around, you want to be able to stabilize very quickly. And actually, some of these heteromorph shapes were very good at being able to do that. Now, also, when you do those buoyancy calculations and you try to reconstruct the orientation of the shell, for some of these heteromorphs, the aperture, the bit the animal is sticking out of, you can see the reconstruction of the animal here, is pointing upwards into the water column, not sideways or down like the Nautilus, which feeds on the sea floor. So what's going on with that? Why are these heteromorph ammonites facing upwards into the water column? And that's also something that's confused a few people as well, but there are good reasons for that. And I'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. We don't have the soft tissues of ammonites. We typically only find the shells, but there are other structures associated with these fossils that can tell us something about what they were like when they were alive. So as far back as Mary Anning, searching on the beaches of Lyme Regis, 200 years ago, she sometimes found these weird structures associated with ammonite shells, and they're called aptaci or apticus. And this is an example from the Jurassic of Germany, where you can see the outline of the shell, the ammonite shell, and you see a strange looking black sort of platy structure here right in the aperture where the animal would have been sticking out. And there's been a big debate over sort of the last 200 years even among paleontologists as to what these structures represent. It was thought for a long time that they might have been a sort of hood Nautilus has a hood that it can sort of close up the aperture and protect the animal. And that might be the case with some of them, but in actual fact, in some cases, they're too small to cover the aperture of the ammonite shell. And the other idea is that these are ammonite jaws. They're the hard jaws of the ammonite that has been preserved and fossilized in these sediments. And that is the idea that most people now think is correct, that these are ammonite jaws. And we've found a lot of examples of them in different ammonite groups, in different shells. And some of them look a bit like this. They're actually quite similar to the Nautilus jaws. So you see these black structures with these sort of curved hook-like structures. These are the jaws of this ammonite specimen. Here you can see another example from the Jurassic of Germany. There's the jaw preserved close to the aperture. And in this fossil, you've actually got this sort of lumpy structure back here. And some paleontologists think that these are the stomach contents of the ammonite. So you've got the jaws, and then here you've actually got what it was actually eating. And in this particular example, that little area there is full of the tiny jaws of baby ammonites, and also bits of kind of organisms that were living on the seabed. So that suggests that this ammonite was eating sort of little baby ammonites, and it was also eating organisms that were living on the seabed. And the jaw structures of that ammonite and the one on the right here, they're quite big, they're quite strong, and maybe these guys could eat prey and scavenge, like we saw the Nautilus in the video scavenging on that trap that the scientists had put down. So some ammonites had these nice strong jaws and could eat prey and scavenge. But what about some of the others? Well, modern cephalopods often have these quite fearsome looking beak-like structures or big robust jaws, even stronger than the Nautilus. Right? Particularly those uncoiled heteromorph ammonites, their jaws don't look like that at all. They're much too sort of thin and flimsy, and they don't really look like they could have been eating or scavenging prey. And a few years ago, a colleague of mine called Isabelle Kruter in Paris decided to put one of these ammonite fossils with a jaw in it through a CT scanner, which is like a big machine that takes images at very high resolution, and it can actually pierce through rock and image a bit like an X-ray machine. And she found associated with the jaw of this ammonite the teeth of the ammonite as well. And although these teeth look kind of scary when you reconstruct them, again, they're pretty thin and they form this sort of plate-like structure. And even more amazingly, Isabelle found fossils actually stuck in the teeth of this heteromorph ammonite, and they were basically plankton fossils. And she interpreted this as the ammonite's last meal. So this ammonite, with its thinner, more gracile jaws, wasn't eating prey or scavenging sort of meaty things. It was just sifting plankton out of the water. And suddenly, those weird heteromorph shapes with the upturned apertures where the animal would have been facing up into the water make sense. They weren't actually scavenging or eating prey. They were just sort of quite passive, filter feeding and eating plankton. And that's kind of interesting. That tells us that ammonites, their shell shapes show a wide range of variation of size and shape. And actually their diets may have been sort of varied as well. Some ate plankton, some ate prey. Now, another thing that we can do is we can actually look at the shells themselves and analyze the chemistry of the shells to tell us something about the ancient environments these animals lived in and where they were living in those environments. So if you're lucky enough to go to a place where the shell of the ammonite is very, very well preserved, and you take a piece of it and you look at it using a microscope, a very powerful microscope, you blow up that shell thousands and thousands of times, this is what it looks like. This is what an ammonite shell is made of. It's made of these little plates that stack up on top of each other of this mineral called aragonite, which is a carbonate mineral. And carbonate minerals are very special because we can take pieces of them, we can grind them up, and we can run them through a fancy machine called a mass spectrometer. And the mass spectrometer looks at the atoms of oxygen in that shell material, in the carbonate minerals, and it looks in particular at what we call isotopes of oxygen. So these are atoms with slightly different atomic masses, and using an equation, we can generate a record and using an equation, translate the data from this machine into a water temperature, because the ratio of these two isotopes, these atoms with different masses of oxygen, depends on the temperature of the water that shell was secreted in by the animal millions of years ago. And as long as that fossil hasn't been wrecked by diagenesis or dissolved away, we can actually reconstruct the water temperature that the animal was living in at the time it was making its shell. And carbonate shells in general, not just ammonites, but any organism that makes a carbonate shell, are like a planetary thermometer, and they enable us to build a temperature record going back millions and millions of years into the past. And this very busy looking plot, each of the little gray dots there is an individual fossil measurement going back millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years from the present day back through time. And this enables us to reconstruct climate change and the ocean change through time using these carbonate shells. And that's partly what I do and what students I work with do, and part of my research as a scientist. I go around the world and I go on field work, in this case to places in North America, to the sedimentary rocks deposited in the Cretaceous period, so about 75 to 66 million years ago. And we collect shells of ammonites, which are very well preserved, specifically looking for really well preserved shells. And then we take their shell and we analyze it using a mass spectrometer, and we reconstruct the temperature that the shell was formed in. Now, this doesn't just tell us about temperature, it actually tells us about where the ammonites were living in the water column. Were they living close to the seafloor? Were they living close to the surface? So here are just some pictures of different ammonites that we've done this work on. So some of them are the nice spiral shell ones, like this one called Sphenodiscus. Some of them are heteromorph ammonites that just start to uncoil their shell, called Discoscophytes. And some of them are these long, straight-shelled heteromorph ammonites called Baculites. And some of these are really well preserved, enough that we can, as I said, go back right to the very, very tiny juvenile ammonite shells. And we can look at the shell material here and even tell where the baby ammonites were living, which is very exciting. And you can take multiple samples all the way through the shell. So in the Baculites here, you can see these black markings. That's each of those black markings is where we take a sample for our isotope analysis. And the same in the Sphenodiscus, you can see we've taken one sample there and one here and one here, and we can reconstruct what the temperature was like as the animal was growing its shell through life. And we can compare the data to organisms where we know where they were living. We're not quite sure where ammonites were living in that water column. Were they on the seabed or were they on the sea surface? So we can analyze organisms like clams, which we know are living on the seafloor. And we can analyze two groups of plankton that make these same carbonate skeletons called foraminifera. And one group of foraminifera live on the seafloor and one group live in the sea surface. And then we can compare our ammonite temperature data with these organisms and see where they fall out. So these shells that we're collecting are from North America, which in the Cretaceous period looked a little bit like this. So these are the stars here are where I go on field work and I collect these shells. This is what it would have looked like the time that the ammonites are around. The sea level was a lot higher and a lot of the continent was flooded with these shallow seas where the ammonites lived. So let's do that. Let's see what the results show. So here's a reconstruction of one of these Cretaceous ecosystems. You can see the sea floor here. We think the water was about 50 to 70 meters deep. Here's the sea surface. Here's our two groups of plankton. So the plankton that live at the bottom and the plankton that live at the sea surface. Here's our clams and snails living on the sea floor, and here are our ammonites. So what do the temperature data show? Well, the clams and snails on the sea floor, they have temperatures of around sort of 15 to 17 degrees C. And so do the plankton that live on the seafloor too. The plankton that live up near the surface of the water, their geochemistry of their shells tells us that the water up here was much warmer. It was about 25 to 30 degrees C. So now we have a difference between the seafloor and the sea surface. And where do the ammonites plot compared to this? Well, a lot of the ammonites come back with temperatures that are very similar to the organisms that lived on the sea floor. suggesting that these ammonites, although they're floating in the water column, they float just above the seabed, much like the Nautilus. But some ammonites have temperatures which are a wider range and overlap with the plankton. So there were some groups that could live higher in the water column or maybe even moved around during their life. And then what about the baby ammonites, the tiny early baby ammonite shells? Well, they show temperatures which are much more similar to the plankton. So what it looks like is that the babies of all these ammonites were living up in the surface ocean as plankton. And then as they grew their shells, they migrate down into an environment that's much closer to the seabed. So they change their environment as they grow. But as babies, they were probably part of the plankton. So the final thing I want to talk about today is why ammonites are not around today. So we've reconstructed a little bit about what they were like as animals, what they could eat, what their shell orientation was, and where they lived in the ocean. But why don't we see them around today? Well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the phenomena of mass extinction events, and there have been several mass extinction events in the history of Earth. And these are intervals of time where, for some reason, a huge percentage of life on our planet has gone extinct over a very short period of time. And there have been, as I said, 5 of these, going back to about 500 million years ago. Probably the most famous mass extinction event is this one, 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous, when up to 76% of species went extinct. It's not the biggest, though. The biggest is the one at the end of the Permian period, about 250 million years ago, when almost 100%, 96% of species might have gone extinct. And here on the red arrow here is the sort of length of time that ammonites were around on our planet. So they survived this huge end Permian extinction and the one at the end of the Triassic and this one in the Devonian. But at the one at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, they died out, they went extinct, along with the dinosaurs, the giant marine reptiles, the pterosaurs, and many, many other groups as well. And of course, you may know that the leading theory behind what caused this extinction event 66 million years ago is that a giant asteroid collided with the Earth. But how do you go from an asteroid impact to killing off all the ammonites? How does that work? And why did ammonites go extinct and nautiloids, which is the group that the modern Nautilus belongs to, survive? Now, nautiloids have a fossil record that goes back even further than ammonites. The early nautiloids were around, 450 million years ago. And they've survived all of these mass extinctions and they're still around today. And that's part of my research as well, that I'm interested in, what caused this mass extinction? Why do ammonites die out and why do nautiloids survive? And one reason that we think that nautiloids survived this event is that they potentially their babies lived in a different environment to ammonites. So nautiloids today lay their eggs on the sea floor. They lay these big eggs. This is actually a modern nautilus egg from the Monterey Bay Aquarium in America. They lay these big eggs on the sea floor, and the baby nautilus develops inside this egg for quite a long time, almost a year, and then it hatches out as like a miniature adult, like a tiny adult specimen, and then it grows up into these big adult nautilus that we see today that just hang around near the seafloor scavenging. When we look at fossil nautiloids, they look very similar to the modern ones. And when we break their shells down and look at the baby part of the shell, we see that the hatchling shells are very big. So this tells us that nautiloids have been doing this same strategy for many, many millions of years. Now, as I said, based on our isotope data and also based on looking at the morphology of these tiny ammonite shells, juvenile ammonites were probably very different. So they may have hatched out of eggs that were on the sea floor, but once they hatched out of the egg, they actually made their way up to the surface waters and were part of the plankton. And they just floated around in the plankton for some interval of time, maybe a couple of years, while they grew up and secreted their shell. And then they transitioned to living perhaps through the water column or close to the sea floor. And usually this is an advantage. And this is one reason why ammonites were perhaps so widespread and so successful and were able to evolve all those weird and wonderful shell shapes. Because if you're part of the plankton, you can disperse all over the planet, you can float passively in the surface waters of the ocean. So usually an advantage, but perhaps in this case, it wasn't an advantage. And that's because this extinction event is really, really bad for the plankton. So this is an outcrop of rock in Italy. You can see these layers of rock, really nice layers of rock, which were deposited on the deep sea floor, many hundreds of meters deep. And today they've been tilted by tectonic forces, so they're lying at an angle. The older rocks are on the right-hand side and the younger rocks are on the left. You're looking at a sequence of rocks about exactly 66 million years ago. And you can see this nice prominent boundary running through the middle, this layer. And that's referred to as the KT or KPG boundary. It's the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods. And in this layer of rock is the debris from this giant asteroid impact. Now, when you look at the Cretaceous rocks using a microscope, you can see all these plankton fossils, many different shapes, many different sizes, some even in shallow water sites, you can find baby ammonites as well. But in the Paleogene rocks after the asteroid impact, 90% of those plankton have gone extinct. This is the biggest mass extinction in plankton in the entire history of the group. It's really, really bad. And that tells us that something really bad happened to the surface waters of the ocean. So the leading idea for what happened is that this asteroid impact happened, a giant rock about 10 kilometers wide, slammed into the earth in an area of Mexico called the Yucatan Peninsula. And that rock slammed into the earth. It blasted a huge cloud of debris into the atmosphere. And two things happened. One was that the asteroid happened to hit an area where the rocks that were buried there that the asteroid plowed into had lots of sulfur minerals in the rocks. And that sulfur was blasted into the atmosphere and then it settled out as sulfuric acid. And that sulfuric acid turned the surface of the ocean acidic for a short period of time. As well as that, all of the debris that was thrown up into the atmosphere, it goes around the world and it blocks out the sun in this giant dust cloud, which lasts for maybe 10, 20, 30 years. That doesn't sound very long when we're talking about millions of years and fossils surviving for millions of years. But 30 years of darkness, you're not going to have any plants growing. There's going to be very, very cold temperatures. It's a very, very bad time. And eventually when that dust cloud clears and life can start to recover, many things will have gone extinct. So let's go back to our nice, happy Cretaceous ocean reconstruction here with our ammonites floating around in it. After the asteroid impact, you have this period of ocean acidification, and that's going to kill off your plankton. And then you have this period of global darkness, the photosynthesis shuts down, and organisms that are higher up the food chain, that are eating things like plants or even the plankton that have already gone extinct, they start to die out and the food chain collapses. And that's why we think this mass extinction was so severe. And for ammonites, it's the end. Not only does the ocean acidification kill off where the babies are living, but then the darkness and the photosynthesis kills off the rest of the plankton that many of these other groups of ammonites were eating. Other organisms that were eating the ammonites then die out and the whole thing just collapses. So when the darkness has cleared, we're left with a very different, no ammonites in it at all. And that's kind of interesting, again, when we compare the ammonites with the nautiloids, the nautilus that survived the extinction. Because if we didn't know anything about what was going to happen before that asteroid impact happened, and we looked at these two groups of cephalopods side by side, ammonites and nautiloids, which one do you think we would pick that might survive an extinction event like this? Ammonites are very abundant. They had lots of species and they had all these different forms and shapes. They had their planktonic babies so they could spread all around the world. Nautiloids, well, they're always less common than ammonites. When you're out hunting for fossils, you will find maybe 5 ammonites to 1 nautiloid or maybe even more. Much less abundant. They've always been much less diverse. And nautiloid fossils pretty much look the same as the modern Nautilus. They don't look like they evolved lots of different shapes and sizes. If you were going to pick a winner out of these two groups, I think you would pick the Ammonites. But in this case, that wasn't true. And that's a really interesting lesson, I think, for us to get from the Ammonite fossil record, that they were really successful for millions and millions of years. But they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous when the environment changed too rapidly for them to adapt, and that preferred environment and their preferred sort of strategy didn't work anymore, and they died out as a result. So hopefully in this talk, I've told you a little bit about how we can reconstruct what these shells were actually like as animals, what they can tell us about these ancient ecosystems, and why they're not around today. So next time that you're out fossil hunting and you might find a shell of an ammonite, now you might know a little bit more and think a little bit more about what it was like as an animal and what it might be able to tell us about sort of ancient oceans on our planet. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Lyme Regis Fossil Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That was really fascinating. I wonder if I could ask a question before you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Listening to Thomas Clement's talk this morning about how soft fleshy tissue has been fossilized. Has an ammonite ever been found that, you know, a full ammonite with the fleshy bits fossilized?
Well, yes. I actually have a picture of it here. So earlier this year, you might have seen this fossil discovery. It even made the New York Times, which is quite unusual for fossil. There are these reports of soft tissue preservation in ammonites, but they're very, very rare, and they're quite controversial because really this kind of just looks like a blob. And how can you go from that to reconstructing the internal organs, which is what this group of scientists that found this fossil actually did. And they're quite controversial. Some people don't quite, you know, believe that this really is the soft part of the ammonite animal preserved. But so I think the sort of jury is still out on whether this really is a soft-bodied part of an ammonite as a fossil. And I think we're still waiting. I'm still hoping, and I know a lot of paleontologists still hope that somewhere out there, someday, someone will find an ammonite animal actually as a convincing fossil.
Thank you. A couple of questions from the Zoom call. First one from Noah. How did fish survive the mass extinction events?
Yeah, so that's interesting because, you know, some fish lived in the same part of the water as the ammonites, but fish also, you know, like the Nautilus, there are many that sort of live deep down in the ocean and are unaffected by what's going on in the surface oceans. Fish are also scavengers, so they'll eat pretty much anything that's coming their way in some cases. Many fish do go extinct at these mass extinction events. Some of these extinctions are really, really bad for fish as well. So in some cases, it's just where you're living, what you're eating, and sometimes it's just luck as well as to how you survive.
Thank you. Next question from Vincent Shepherd. What use were the sutures in the chambers?
Yeah, so the analogy I like to think of with the sutures is that, and maybe I'll go back in my slides all the way to the start, is that they're a little bit like the beams holding up the roof. So if you have a roof and you've got beams that often are supporting that roof, the sutures are much the same. So you have these septa, these structures, and where they touch the inside of the shell, they branch out into these amazing suture patterns, and they strengthen the shell. So as an animal, you can actually make that shell thinner if you have this nice complicated suture line. So they might have been to help strengthen the shell, and that's why some ammonites evolved these really, really complicated ones.
Thank you. Next question from Megan. Like modern cephalopods, if ammonites had mineralized hard jaws, why do you think it's so rare to find preserved jaws, both attached to the shell or separate in a fossil record?
They're actually not that rare.
Right.
It's quite surprising. In my experience, to some of the places you go where you can find fossil shells, you will find ammonite jaws preserved there. People just don't really know what they look like, so they tend to sort of skip over them because they're these weird sort of black structures. They're often sort of triangular shaped, but they're actually surprisingly common. And in most places where you find ammonite shells, you can find their jaws preserved in the fossil record.
Thank you. A question from Leslie. If they swim backwards, do they have any other sensors to help them navigate?
That's always an interesting question, and it's one that people, whenever they see videos like the one I showed of the Nautilus, the modern Nautilus swimming backwards, it just looks so sort of ungainly. They probably had quite complex eyes, so they could actually kind of look around and see where they were going. You saw in the Nautilus, it was swimming by kind of twisting backwards and forwards, so it's sort of looking where it's going, but occasionally you bump into things because you're swimming backwards. We just don't know what sensors they might have had as well, because that would have been part of the soft body that isn't preserved. But presumably in that respect, they were quite like the Nautilus. They could actually sort of look to see where they were going.
This question from the Smiths. How big was the biggest Ammonite ever found?
That's a great question. It depends what you mean. The biggest sort of spiral one that I've seen was a couple of meters across. That's from the Jurassic of Germany, and I think also it's been the same species has been found in Canada. Some of those heteromorph ammonites, so the ones that are sort of uncoiled, some of those get really, really long. I've seen heteromorph shells that are 3 or 4 meters long, that are sort of weird paperclip shapes. So they got pretty big. Yeah.
Another one from Vincent. Did heteromorphs exist before the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction?
Yes, they did. They were around in the Cretaceous period. In fact, during the Cretaceous period is when the heteromorphs really become very successful and very widespread. You find their fossils all over the world. So they were one of the most common groups of ammonites right before the KPG extinction. And people used to think, oh, maybe those weird shapes are because somehow the heteromorphs are like an evolutionary dead end, and actually that's one reason why they went extinct. But that's not true at all. As I hope I showed you in the talk, they were actually very successful group of organisms despite having those really weird shapes.
Okay, thank you. And I think the last one from Noah. Are ammonites related to belemnites?
That's also a great question, Noah. Yes, they are, here again on our cephalopod family tree. So here's the ammonites over here in red, and here are the belemnites. So they're another group of cephalopod, and they are a bit like squid and cuttlefish. They have a shell that you can find as well, but the shell was from inside the soft squishy body. So they're sort of cousins of the ammonites as well, but the same group of molluscs. Yeah, so they are related.